Welcome back to Carneades.org and happy Halloween! Today we're going to be looking at Kripkenstein! Now, once upon a time, Ludwig Wittgenstein proposed a paradox for the philosophy of language known as the rule-following paradox. But this paradox was revived by Saul Kripke when he read this paradox and developed it into a serious skeptical challenge for the very idea of meaning. The view represented by Kripke and his skeptical solution to this paradox were not actually Kripke's position, nor, according to Kripke, were they a position which was meant to correctly represent the position of Wittgenstein. Therefore, in order to explain whose views are represented by this paradox, a skeptical hybrid monster was created, Kripkenstein. And many philosophers will refer to this position not as Kripke's position or Wittgenstein's position, but as Kripkenstein's position. So, the whole debate revolves around something called the rule-following paradox. This paradox was stated originally by Wittgenstein in Philosophical Investigations and expanded on by Kripke in Wittgenstein on Rules and Private Language. The paradox questions whether there is some fact of the world which can make true the claim that someone is following some rule correctly, under a correspondence theory of truth that's looking for facts about the world to make statements true. There's a debate as to whether Wittgenstein would claim that there is some fact which can make this true, or no such fact. But rather, as Kripke claims, the ability of the rule-following community to assert that someone follows the rule based on passing some test. So, basically, there is a debate as to how Wittgenstein would solve or did solve the paradox that he created. Maybe he believed that there was some problem in the paradox itself and it could be dismissed, or perhaps he accepted the paradox and that's why he stepped back from truth conditions to assertion conditions. And that's what Kripke is going to follow through with. But first off, let's get a sense of what this paradox is. So Kripke explains the paradox through a discussion of addition, as Wittgenstein does, but Kripke's is a little more clear. So imagine that a student has never added numbers over 57. The student correctly applies the rules of addition for numbers under 57, but when given numbers equal to or larger than 57 to add, always gives the answer as 5. This student is in fact using a different rule. He's not using plus or addition, but rather quus, which acts like plus when the numbers to be added are less than 57, but if either of them is greater than 57, the quum, instead of sum, is always going to be 5. So let's take a look at what this would look like. So we have plus, that says 2 plus 1 equals 3. Well, quus also says that 2 quus 1 equals 3. Well, what about 56 plus 56? That equals 112. 56 quus 56 also equals 112. But here's where things get confusing. 57 plus 1 equals 58, but 57 quus 1 equals 5. Similarly, 100 plus 57 equals 157, but 100 quus 57 equals 5. Basically, what we're saying is these are two separate, well-defined rules which explain what we should do with this operation that looks like a plus sign in these mathematical statements. Which rule someone is following can only be determined by actually having them go out and do those math problems. So until you have someone who is using the quus rule as opposed to the plus rule go out and solve some problem with numbers over 57, then you can't tell if that person is using quus or plus. In fact, there are an infinite number of rules that someone might be following instead of addition. Someone might be following the Chuddition rule, which is like addition for all numbers except for problems including 398, 667, which always equal one more than normal addition might dictate. Unless they actually were given a problem with 398, 667 in it, there would be no fact in the world which would determine that they were following Chuddition or addition. In fact, since there are an infinite number of possible addition problems and possible rules that we could create based on someone's past behavior with addition, and since no one can do an infinite number of addition problems, there is no fact of the world which can tell us that any given person is following the rules of addition or some other set of rules which is slightly different. And it would seem that if someone did once do a problem involving 398, 667, and accidentally got one more than normal addition would dictate, this would be good evidence that they were following chuddition and not addition. But this isn't just a problem for basic addition, but rather for a range of generalizations and for meaning itself. How can you tell if someone is actually following the rule, water is H2O, unless they actually identify all things that are water in the world? Perhaps they would identify most things that are H2O as water, but would identify some things that aren't H2O and call them water. They aren't really following the rule, water is H2O, or they aren't following the meaning of the word water. Or they have a different meaning or a separate language that they're talking about. What fact about the world proves true the statement that Jopnam uses the word cousin correctly when he has not identified all the cousins in the world? There might be one or two that he might identify differently based on what would actually be a different rule for the meaning of cousin, and therefore be following, like I said, a different rule. If there is no fact about the world which makes it true, then Wittgenstein's correspondence theory cannot give it a truth value. Now, Kripke looks at and dismisses a number of quote-unquote straight solutions, as Hume might call them, or claims that this paradox is falsitical, as Quine might say. Basically, these are claims that there is something wrong in the reasoning of the paradox, and it can be dismissed as invalid. Here are a few examples. So, we have straight solutions and we have skeptical responses. So, meaning is determined by past use. So, Kripke's skeptical responses are going to be past use is consistent with rules which diverge from the traditional rule only in cases not yet tested. So, we might say, well, maybe I haven't solved any problem with 398, 667 before, but in the past, I've always used addition instead of chuddition, and so we would expect that I would use addition there. But the problem is, my use of addition and my use of chuddition are equally well confirmed by my past behavior, so long as I haven't done any problems with that number in them. And if I had made a mistake, as I mentioned before, on a problem with a specific number in it, that actually seems to be evidence that I'm not following addition, but rather following some other rule, because we're basing my ability to follow a certain rule or determining which rule I'm following based on my past behavior. So if I made one mistake in any one math problem, then that would be evidence that I'm not following addition, but rather a different rule. Maybe we would say instead someone's ability to state a rule determines if they use it correctly. Say, well, I didn't solve every single addition problem in the world, but I can explain to you exactly what the necessary and sufficient conditions for addition are, exactly what it means for something to be addition. There's some skeptical responses here. Many people cannot give perfect definitions of the words they use every day. I couldn't define for you, say, what caffeine is, but most people would think that I would be able to use the word caffeine and mean the same thing as they would and follow the same rules, even though I can't give a perfect definition of that. And even there are many people that seem to be able to use addition but couldn't give a perfect definition of it. And more powerfully, any of the words used in the stating of the rule are just as subject to this problem. So if I said, well, of course I can use the word water, I claim that water is H2O. So anything that's H2O is water. So I'm able to use this word importantly. Well, the problem is that what am I meaning exactly by H2O? Maybe by hydrogen, I mean I'm following a slightly different rule when it comes to hydrogen than you're following. Maybe I'm counting certain things as hydrogen and certain things that aren't hydrogen in there. And so any of the words in my definition are going to be subject to this paradox as well. If I then try to define hydrogen, we'll have the same problem with any of the words that I use in that definition, and so on and so forth. And another straight solution, there are more, we're not going to get into all of them, is there is a fact about the world of my disposition to answer such questions in a particular way. One of the skeptical responses is people have the disposition to make mistakes with addition and with identifying something as water, so based on that, as with based on past use, this is going to actually reinforce the claim that you are following a different rule, you aren't following the addition or water naming rule. And this solution, according to Kripke, is going to be descriptive. It explains what someone will do, not normative, explaining what they should do in order to remain consistent. And Kripke is going to be looking for that normative rule. So those are a couple examples of the straight solutions and the skeptical responses that Kripke is going to use to continue to keep Kripkenstein, this paradox, alive in the face of people that might call it falsitical. Instead, Kripke proposed a skeptical solution, or kind of an antinomious solution, which accepts that this is a paradox, but changes one of the central conceits of the position to avoid the paradox. So instead of changing one of the situations of the paradox and claiming that that's false, he actually backs down the position of talking about, when we're talking about meaning, what do we mean by that? Instead of saying that it's true that someone is following a rule, he says we as a community can assert that someone is following a rule. As Wittgenstein does in his philosophical investigations, though, he doesn't necessarily connect that perfectly to this paradox. Instead of rule following being determined by some fact in the world, we can assert it as a community based on whether they pass a test that all members of the community must pass, like being able to solve a math problem or being able to identify a concept. So instead of having to test them on everything, we as a community that follows a rule make up a test that says, does a person that would be accepted into this community, if they're able to pass it, we're going to assert as a community that they follow the rule, even if the truth of the matter is that they follow some other rule. Okay? So as a skeptic, I'm worried that such assertions are not sufficient to deal with the bigger problem of Kripkenstein, of not being able to determine if someone is following a rule. And that this kind of glosses over the deep problem that we can't truly say that anyone is using words in the way that they seem to be. What do you think? Is there any way that we can determine if someone is following one rule over another? Does that even matter? And are assertions sufficient to deal with the problems? Keep your eyes out for Kripkenstein trying to steal the truth and meaning of your words this Halloween, and stay skeptical, everybody.